Good morning and welcome to the second meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. Mark Griffin, MSP, and Fulton McGregor, MSP, will be joining us remotely this morning, and I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent and that all other notifications are turned off during the meeting. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 5, 6 and 7 in private. Are members agreed? We're all agreed, thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny of the Scottish Government budget 2025 to 26. And we have 75 minutes for this discussion, so I would be grateful if we can keep questions and answers as succinct as possible. And we're joined for this item by Shona Robson, MSP, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government. And the Cabinet Secretary is joined by Scottish Government officials, Ellen Lever, who's the Acting Director for Local Government, and Ian Story, who's the Head of Local Government Finance. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary and her officials to the meeting, and I'd like to begin by inviting Ms Robson to make a brief opening statement.
Thanks very much, and good morning, Convener, and good morning to the committee. Thanks for inviting me to give evidence to the committee today. The 25-26 Scottish Budget seeks to improve the lives of the people of Scotland and deliver on this government's priorities to eradicate child poverty, grow the economy, tackle the climate emergency and support sustainable high-quality public services. The budget recognises the importance of local government and is providing local authorities with a record funding package of over £15 billion in 25-26, which is a £1 billion increase compared to 24-25. Independent analysis by the Scottish Parliament Information Centre confirms that the 2025-26 local government settlement includes a cash and real terms increase for both resource and capital. Through the Verity House Agreement, the Scottish Government has renewed our commitment to a relationship with local government based on mutual trust and respect, and agreed to seek new ways of working together to ensure the people of Scotland receive the public services they can expect and deserve. As we discussed in the evidence session prior to the budget, the Verity House Agreement and the fiscal framework represent a journey, not a destination. We're never going to wake up one day and all the challenges be magically resolved. As with any relationship, it takes time and hard work to make things better. And we've invested a lot of time and hard work into the first year of the Verity House Agreement, and there's been demonstrable positive progress in the implementation of the agreement's principles. This has included joint work on local government pay, enabling councils to double the full rate of council tax on second homes, delivering a new national allowance for foster and kinship carers, and close engagement around the circular economy bill. The settlement has been informed by extensive engagement with local government, both at an official and political level. This has allowed for evidence to be jointly developed and an improved joint understanding of the challenges faced by both spheres of government. The positive impact of this engagement has been recognised by COSLA and acknowledged by the Scottish Parliament Information Centre in their briefing on local government finance published on the 20th of December. This briefing also emphasised COSLA's positive response to the 2025-26 budget. Indeed, I welcome COSLA's acknowledgement that the settlement has increased substantively. I remain committed to continue to make progress against our shared priorities in partnership with local government and to ensuring that we work collectively to deliver sustainable public services across Scotland. I look forward to engaging with members today and answering any questions that the committee may have.
Thanks very much for that statement, and I'll begin with a couple of questions before I bring members in, and these are around just the 2025-26 revenue settlement. And I'd be interested to hear your response to COSLA when they say that the settlement may not be enough to reverse planned cuts to vital services, and to what extent has the government, what assessment has the government made in terms of calculating the cost to councils of providing statutory services and then meeting the challenges of inflation?
Oh, thanks, Convener. As I set out in my opening statement, adjusting for pay and pensions, the budget provides a cash terms increase in revenue of £599.6 million. That equates to a cash terms increase of 4.5%, and a real terms increase of 2%. Importantly, it also includes £289 million for local priorities, so discretionary spend, general revenue grants. So that's money that is not ring-fenced in any way. We've also allocated an additional £108 million of general capital grant, which is a real terms increase of 14.2%. And we've reinstated £31 million used for the 24-25 pay deal, giving a total capital increase of £139 million. So the spending power of local authorities is essentially £707 million higher in 25-26 than it was in 24-25. Does that mean that there are no difficult decisions for local government or indeed any other part of the public sector? No, it doesn't. And the importance of public sector reform, doing things differently, is as important for local government as it is for any other part of the public sector. But what it does mean is that there is a recognition of the challenges that local government was facing. And I think this settlement, as confirmed by SPICE, is a fair one, and one that should enable local authorities to minimise the impact on local services and indeed minimise any council tax increases because of it being a fair settlement. Probably a fairer settlement than local government themselves had anticipated perhaps at the start of this process.
Okay, thanks for that. One of the issues that we're all aware of in terms of that settlement is the national insurance funding, and I'd be interested to get an update from you on the funding being provided by the UK government to cover the direct and indirect cost of the public sector in Scotland and in terms of the increase in employers' national insurance.
Yeah.
How does that amount of funding compare to the estimated cost? So
first of all, on the estimated cost from local government, COSLA's own analysis was that they would require £265 million, although I do note that I think it was the Fraser of Allender Institute had said they thought it was more like £220 million. So I think it depends what local government have included. Some had clearly included things like ALIOs, some had included things like Social Care Commission services. So getting to and we're working with COSLA to get to the kind of fine-tuning of their requirements. Having said that, the Treasury, we have been communicating with the Treasury. We have 3 pieces of communication to which we've had no response to any of them. The last was the joint letter from the First Minister and the President of COSLA, signed by 48 other organisations that were making the point that anything short of full funding would not be acceptable. There had been a figure put into the public domain that was circa a figure that had an upper amount of £320 million. Now that is at least £200 million short of what core public services will require. That's not taking into account any commission services or GP services or anything like that. That's just core. So we have yet to have a figure confirmed from Treasury, and we've yet to have a reply to our substantive request to Treasury. Once there is a final figure, then what I've said is we will give a fair distribution of that. Clearly, given the figures I set out at the beginning of this answer compared to what the worst case scenario might be from Treasury, then local government could not get 100% of their employers' national insurance contribution funded. Otherwise, there would be nothing left for the rest of the public sector. But I want to be fair to local government in that the distribution. But I should end with an optimistic note. I have not given up on pushing the Treasury for a fairer coverage of employers' national insurance contribution. We have asked for the full cost of Scotland's public sector to be covered, rather than just a Barnett share, which of course doesn't recognise that we've invested in our public sector over the years and in the pay of our public servants over the years. So it remains outstanding.
Okay, thanks very much. And brief supplementary, Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. On the national insurance contributions, I wonder, given how difficult this is for public services and that the UK government is being asked to fully fund it to make it possible for public services to continue, is it clear to the Scottish Government what the upsides to this policy are?
Well, for every £1 million that's not fully funded from the Treasury for employers' national insurance contribution, that's £1 million that's not going to be able to be put into public services. It's £1 million that won't be able to be used for the delivery of public services or indeed to settle pay deals with public servants. And there is a read across to council tax as well. So for every 100 million for local government, that equates to about 3%, just over 3% council tax. So if, to be blunt, there is a 100 million shortfall of employers' national insurance contributions for local government, then you could equate that quite directly to 3% on council tax bills that we would rather were kept to a minimum. So all of these moving parts are all impacting on one another. The basic premise, though, is one of, I don't think Scotland and Scotland's public services and should be punished for the fact that we've invested in teachers and nurses and other public sector staff to a level beyond that of a Barnett share. I would have thought that would be recognised as a good investment. But, as I say, 3 outstanding pieces of correspondence with the Treasury, and we are chasing them to get to a final position because, I should have said this earlier on, I'm very aware that local government will start to set their budgets soon. So time is of the essence. We don't have a lot of time to get an answer from Treasury. So we need an answer now.
Okay, thanks very much. Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. With pay costs sitting around 60% for local authorities' total spend, and if we look at previous years in relation to cuts that councils have endured, the lack of ability to carry out good public services, worried about maintaining statutory services, there needs to be an overall look, I think, in terms of council finances. But if I can focus back on the pay costs specifically, given that councils have made representation to the Scottish Government in previous years in relation to financial hardship, how confident are you, given the pay costs are sitting around 60%, that this won't happen again this year?
Well, look, fundamentally, COSLA and local government are the employers and lead any discussions around pay. We have become involved to try to support resolution of some of the pay disputes because industrial action is also costly. So we've tried to support resolution to avoid that. This year's settlement, and I should say that one of the things that COSLA had argued for very, very strongly was for money not to be ring-fenced. Therefore, we've minimised ring-fencing. In fact, I think since Verity House, I think 1.5 billion of funding has been de-ring-fenced and another 500 million has been de-ring-fenced in 25-26. So what we've not done within the billion is to say that's for pay, that's for this, that's for... Essentially, it's for local government to decide how they manage the funding that they have. And within that, of course, is the discretionary funding, the 289 million, real terms protection for the general revenue grant, and then they have to make a decision of what level of council tax that they decide upon within each local authority. So I guess it does bring me back to the point I made earlier on as well, that the pay costs of the public sector are substantial. That does require us collectively, including for local government, to look at how we support that going forward. It will mean looking at the size and shape of the public sector. It will mean doing things differently. Shared services, for example, are perhaps not as extensive in local government as they could be. Now, that's a matter for local government, I hasten to add. But when we're looking at public service reform across other parts of the public sector, how can we do things differently? Back office functions, how can they be shared? I would hope that local governments, and I think they are, in the space of looking at some of that as well.
Thank you. And with permission, Convener, given I've had a question on ring fencing further down, if I could take that just now. Given, again, that in previous years the Scottish Government have intervened when councils were making tough financial decisions, for example, last year when we're looking at teacher numbers, just for example, can you give a guarantee this morning that the Scottish Government will not make a guarantee again to councils in terms of what they can and can't cut? And will it be the local authorities' decision in terms of what they will implement in order to create that balanced budget?
So we have managed to secure an agreement with local government to maintain teacher numbers at 2023 levels. And I think that's in recognition that £145 million was in the system. That's now been uprated to 186 to maintain teachers. Now, I think everyone around, well, I would imagine everyone in this committee will recognise the value of making sure we have adequate number of teachers in our schools. If we take issues that I know are current and being debated in this Parliament around reducing, closing the poverty-related attainment gap, tackling behaviour in our classrooms, all of that, it's difficult to see how you would do that with fewer teachers. So I think there's a shared ambition here to make sure that we have adequate teaching staff within our schools. And in order to stabilise that position is why we have agreement with local government to maintain 2023 levels. In addition to that, of course, we've also put more money into additional support needs because we've recognised that particularly since COVID, there's been an uptick of the number of children with additional support needs. So that's been recognised. So there is a balance here in saying government priorities in terms of education, in terms of closing the poverty-related attainment gap. Do we maintain some control, some influence over how that's delivered, or do we not? And I think there's a balance to be struck there. So, policy in terms of policy, sitting with education has been very explicitly to close the poverty-related attainment gap. And we believe very much that the teaching staff, it's not the only workforce in this space. Other workforces have a critical impact on this as well. But teachers are at the heart of reducing, closing the poverty-related attainment gap. And therefore, I don't think it's unreasonable for government then to say to local government, the funding we provide for that purpose has to deliver outcomes. And the outcome has to be that we don't see the way we have a maintenance of the teaching staff to deliver that. These are finely balanced, and we do recognise that local government may have a differing view when it comes to these matters, but we've managed to get, I think, to a compromise position that recognises the view of local government, but also recognises the policy view of the Scottish Government and an issue that's been debated in Parliament on a number of occasions.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Megan. And I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey with a couple of questions.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your colleagues. Could I ask a question about the council tax, everybody's favourite subject, I suppose, at this committee? You're on record saying that you don't think there's any need for substantial rises to the council tax, and your opening remarks also said that the settlement should minimise any council tax increases that people may face. Is the government minded to give an indication of what it considers to be reasonable at the moment?
So, look, so we expect councils to set council tax rates, giving careful consideration to obviously to local needs and services, while also at the same time, I guess, being mindful of on the impact on residents and household budgets, which are still, under pressure. As I've said earlier in my answers, for 25-26, councils will receive over £15 billion through the settlement. I think that should mean that there's no need for any excessive inflation-busting increases. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm not going to set a figure that I think, that is it, and anything above that is absolutely appalling. I don't think that would be helpful. But, I would hope that we would all be on a reasonable space, that we would want to see increases kept to a minimum. Now, each local authority will be different. And I'm aware that, particularly for some of our smaller authorities, they perhaps have some additional pressures that some of the larger authorities have some resilience around. And I think that's where it's really important for us to look, beyond this budget around the sustainability of some of our local authorities and how can they work together, how can we help them to become more resilient going forward and more sustainable. So, we have listened to local government in their desire to not have a freeze, not have a cap. And I think what the other side of the bargain of that is to therefore recognise that in setting the council tax, they would want to take account of the needs of local residents in doing so. And I hope that we can get to somewhere that is a reasonable landing space. Okay,
thank you for that. I thought I would try and get a good answer. You must be worried, though, about the potential impact of the NI issue. In the figures you gave a moment ago, you said that £100 million is equivalent to 3%. So if it was that figure, or if it's double that I think Cosla mentioned, that could mean a 3 to 6% rise in council tax if it was completely pushed into that. You would be concerned at that, surely, if that's what happened.
Well, I'd be very concerned at that, which is why I made the point that getting a full funding of the public sector here in Scotland is very important. So, if you take local government, they're arguing the same, that just because we have a local government position here in Scotland that is beyond what the Barnett share for local government would be, that there shouldn't be a punishment for local government or the health service or any other, because we've invested over the years in our public services beyond what the rest of the UK have done. This is a UK government decision on employers' national insurance contributions out of the blue without any warning. And I don't think, I think the onus is on them to fully recognise the impact on Scotland's public services, including the impact on local government. Now, when it comes to the final position of, here is the number and what do we do with that number, whatever it is, what I've said is I want to be fair to local government. But being fair to local government doesn't mean I can 100% cover the costs of employers' national insurance contribution, because I would have literally nothing left for the rest of the public sector, for the health service, for police, for fire. But I do want to be fair, and I recognise that there is timing is an issue here for local government, given that budget setting will begin quite soon. So we do need to get this resolved. All I can say to you and the committee is that we are chasing Treasury on a daily basis, really, to get an answer.
If we continue, though, to be ignored, you say we've written 3 letters and there's been no response to that, would that force you to have to reconsider whether to impose a cap if the local authorities chose to apply that?
No, we're not going to look at any kind of cap, we are working in partnership with local government, which is why the last letter was co-signed by the First Minister and the President of COSLA, because we're all on the same page here about needing a fair recognition from the UK Government of the employer's national insurance costs. And I think COSLA absolutely recognise as well that if that is not forthcoming, then they understand that the quantum that is available will have to be a fair distribution. They understand that that doesn't mean that they'll have 100% of their employer's national insurance covered. We have, through the budget statement I set out, the 15 billion to local government, and of course with kind of record levels of investment to health. Also, we've built in some resilience into budgets, but it's an opportunity cost. For every million that has to go on employers' national insurance contributions, there's $1 million that's not going on frontline services. It's $1 million that's not going to resolve this year's pay disputes, pay negotiations. Getting ahead, there hopefully will be no disputes to help with pay negotiations. So, these are opportunity costs, but as I say, it remains to be seen what the final landing space is.
Okay, thanks for that, Cabinet Secretary. On social care services, you spoke about that too, and you'll be aware of the Feely and Accounts Commission telling us that the demands are pretty severe in that area. If there is any scope, any unallocated resource, would that be amongst your priorities for additional support, if it's possible?
Well, I recognise the pressures on social care, and it's a whole system pressure at the end of the day. And I obviously am aware of the COSLA Finance spokesperson's most recent correspondence. I suppose what I would say is that in the draft budget on the 4th of December, I set out almost £2.2 billion of investment in social care and integration. And that exceeds our commitment to increase funding by 25% over this Parliament. That was the commitment, 25% over this Parliament. That figure exceeds that by over £350 million. So we've delivered what we said we would deliver in terms of social care investment. And of course that includes the £125 million to fund the real living wage uplift for adult social care workers in commissioned services, because we recognise that the commissioned services have a fragility around them that if they can't hold on to staff is profound, and therefore the real living wage is so important. And that's why that was funded. Now, does that level of investment mean that there's not pressures? No, there's still pressures, and that's why we're taking a whole system approach. First Minister's talked extensively about the interventions to improve performance of partnerships, because there's variation there that is sometimes quite difficult to explain, and therefore with the resources that we have in the system, they need to be working effectively. We need to reduce delayed discharge. We need to address all of that. So there is a worry around the employers' national insurance contributions for social care commission services that COSLA estimate is around £85 million. We will continue to discuss that with COSLA, because the last thing we want is for social care commission services to cease because of the employer's national insurance contributions, because that impacts on the whole system. So we are still discussing these matters about making sure that that does not come to pass.
Okay. Thanks very much for your detailed answers to those questions, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Willie. Before I bring in Mark Griffin with questions, starting our next theme, which is around capital, debt and financial sustainability, I'm going to have to ask us to move to more succinct questions and answers, just in the interest of time. And Mark Griffin's joining us online. Mark, come on in.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In this year's financial settlement, there is a real terms increase of £120 million compared to last year on capital funding. But I just wonder what your response would be then to COSLA, who have said that much of that increase has been committed already, and that it only in part reverses the reduction made to capital funding for this financial year.
Well, I would say that we have recognised the position and the importance of capital to local government. So the 25-26 budget sets out over 7 billion of. Sorry, I'm just looking at that's So I'll come on to the affordable housing position in a moment, but for the overall, so in the earlier answer, I referred to the general capital grant. So we've allocated an additional £108 million of general capital grant, which is a real terms increase of 14.2%. And we've reinstated the £31 million used for the 24-25 pay deal, giving a total capital increase of £139 million. I think one of the things I would say that COSLA, where I would perhaps push back slightly, so £40 million was allocated from Scotland for capital funding for local government, which is essentially completely discretionary as long as it's in the kind of net zero space, but it's new money. COSLA perhaps haven't recognised it as new money in the way that I would have liked or expected them to have done so. So there's going to be very few restrictions on how that 40 million is spent, but it is not regarded as new money in the way that perhaps I think it perhaps should have been. Just to add the point that Ellen was pointing me to around, beyond that, of course, we've also got the £768 million for the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. That was one of the big asks of COSLA around the housing budget. And we have other investments that local government will have a benefit from, like the energy efficiency and clean heat measures, etc. So I think that I know that they've asked for additional capital, but I do think the capital position is a fair one.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wanted to talk as well about the innovative measures to fund capital projects that you have talked about. In response to the committee previously, you highlighted the example of the government working with Edinburgh Council to unlock investment in Granton as one of those examples. I just wonder if what specifically is the government's role in that investment in Granton? What funding streams are being considered, and whether funding models like that could be used by other local authorities, particularly in rural areas where there are particular struggles that you highlighted anyway earlier in relation to the size of some local authorities.
Yeah. So basically the agreement with the City of Edinburgh Council for Granton is outcomes-based funding. So it will help to unlock funding for site remediation, upfront infrastructure and enabling works required for the development at Granton to proceed. And it basically will be, the guarantee is that we will pay the revenue costs of that investment, and that's from 2028-29 onwards, conditional on the development meeting pre-agreed outcomes. So the Edinburgh Council and the Scottish Futures Trust have been working on the detail of the deal to get this landed. And of course, the importance of all of this is that phase 1 of the Granton project aims to unlock over 800 new homes, and we know how important they are within the Edinburgh area. Mark Griffin asked me, well, could this be done elsewhere? And I think it could. It might. The scale of the Granton project is quite extensive because of the the size of the area being developed, the component parts. There's a transport element, there's a housing element, regeneration element. So there's bits of money from different parts of government. Happy to follow up with some more detail on the various bits of that if the committee would find it helpful. But in principle, I don't see why we couldn't come to similar agreements with other local authorities. I've made that offer to COSLA, that we could work together around that proposition of what are the priorities, where are the areas that we need to see the growth in affordable housing, that we could bring together a similar deal. I don't see why it couldn't apply in a rural setting. I also think there's maybe potential for more than one local authority to come together as a partnership across a number of local authorities, perhaps, to agree a similar deal. So I think this is an innovative way that levers in additional investment beyond the traditional routes, and it's one that I'm keen to see further explored.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
If I can touch on what sort of just transition and net zero, because how do you and how does local government play its role when we're dealing with the just transition and net zero, given the conditions of existing infrastructure, when you're looking at what they have to manage with their ageing schools, libraries, council buildings, leisure centres and road networks? So are councils sufficiently funded to take the action that's required to meet the targets in 2045? So
I think it's challenging for local government in the same way as it is for the rest of the public sector, just the enormity of it. And I think what I would say is that we need to lever in private investment on the back of well-used strategic investment of public finances. So let me give you one example. If you look at heat networks, Glasgow are quite far advanced down this road with the concept that you use public buildings as an anchor to lever in private finance. So you would have a revenue stream from those public buildings in terms of a heat network, and that would enable then for a hub and spoke to bring in other buildings, and you build your heat network up around that model. It's a model that's been used elsewhere in other parts of the UK, but also in other countries. So we can't do this through public funding alone. We've got to lever in private finance, but we need to be able to do that through de-risking, through having clear revenue streams to be able to incentivise that investment. There's then, one of the reasons I was keen to give local government some of the ScotWind money was first of all, to make sure the benefits of ScotWind reached all communities, but also for them to then be able to use that in an imaginative way to lever in some of their own external funding sources potentially, to be able to make some of their own choices, to collaborate with each other and with other public bodies. So it was really funding that was very flexible to be able to oil the wheels of some of that investment. Some local authorities are further ahead of others in this space. It was ever so when it comes, you don't have 32 local authorities all moving at the same pace. I think the cities have an important kind of city-region anchor. I think it's more difficult for some of the smaller local authorities to be able to have the capacity and leverage that perhaps other bigger authorities do. So working together around in a regional basis, I think, is what we will probably see more of.
And when we come to the sort of financial stability of local government, we've talked in the past about where we are and how confident the Scottish Government are about the data that's required, and they need to have to assess some of that financial stability for local authorities. And we've talked in the past about the debt and the reserve levels, and given the sort of pessimistic outlook from the survey from local government that gave us some of the concerns. What are the Scottish Government's views on local government when it comes to the amount of specific councils in terms of debt and reserves that they have and are able to be financially sustainability of them? Because that is a major issue for them as to whether what they can deal with depending on what they have in reserves, and some have much and some have very little, but all councils seem to have debt.
So first of all, you're right about variation. 32 local authorities is very, very different. And of course, some of the reserve was built up over the COVID period, where there was quite substantial reserves built up. Much of that is now kind of allocated to specific purposes. I mean, the issue of debt, of course, local government has borrowing powers, actually something the Scottish Government does not have in that regard. So debt is not an unusual thing, but it's how it's managed and the sustainability of it. Now, if you compare the position of Scottish local authorities with the position in England, for example, one of the some of the powers around, well, I was going to say general competence, but it won't be described as that within an English setting. Some of the decisions that some of the English local authorities made that have got them into some difficulty, I think I would raise some eyebrows around the level of risk and appropriateness. Well, local authorities here in Scotland do not have the ability to make some of those same poor investment decisions, and therefore have not got the same, or not carrying some of the same level of risk that has seen some of the bankruptcies that we've seen in England. Now, local government in Scotland is very keen to have a wide array of powers, the power of general competence, and I'm very sympathetic to that. I think we do that within a context of sustainability, financial prudence, and making sure that the point you made about debt levels is within a manageable space. Now, Audit Scotland, the Accounts Commission, all have very important roles here, and they have that very detailed oversight of each individual local authority and the collective position. So we proceed with caution, I think, around the expansion of powers to make sure that any powers are used within the kind of framework of responsibility that I think local government would want to make sure they operate in with as well.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Thanks very much, Alexander. I'm going to move to a new area, which is public service reform and the Verity House Agreement. And with a number of questions in that area, I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor, who's also joining us online.
Thanks, Convener. Sorry, I just had to wait to be unmuted there. And good morning to Cabinet Secretary and officials. Thanks very much for your evidence so far. Yeah, as the Convener says, a couple of questions on public service reform within the context of the Verity House Agreement. The first one, Cabinet Secretary, I'm wondering if you can say a wee bit more that, given the demand pressures on council services, which we've already talked about and you've acknowledged, I'm wondering how can the intervention and prevention agenda be further advanced within the existing resources that we have?
So I think prevention and getting, what you would say is getting far more upstream in our public services is as applicable to local government as it is to any other services. Again, some local authorities are getting are further along the road of that than others. If you look at what Glasgow have done with their children's social work services, they have through more better intervention with families in a different way have reduced the number of children coming into care by 50%. And if I was in charge of a social work department in any of the other 31 local authorities, I'd be beating a path to Glasgow's door to look at how they've done that. And I saw it for myself, and really what it is a very different relationship between social work and the families that have have transformed the way that interventions happen in a very positive space, and that has managed to keep families together and to support families and avoid children coming into care. And we know that children remaining with families where it is safe for them to do so is a better outcome. We're also working with local authorities in the Fairer Futures Partnerships in Clackmannanshire, Dundee and Glasgow, where families are getting the help they need where and when they need it, and that is helping to maximise support, getting further upstream, prevention, and we're now expanding this into Aberdeen, East Ayrshire, Inverclyde, North Ayrshire and Perth and Kinross. And it is about trying to get upstream and avoid crisis. There's a lot of other work going on that I'm keen to support and work with local government around. So the single Scottish estate, where services can be shared within the public sector, that should apply and must apply to local government as well, where instead of investing in a whole new building or indeed utilising the buildings we have, many of which are under-occupied, we need to get far smarter at sharing the estate, sharing services as well. We have invested in the Oracle cloud system, which provides HR, financing, purchasing capabilities. There are local authorities that are interested in that system, and I don't see why we shouldn't have more and more onboarding of public sector so we can have that shared service back office function. And procurement, finally, I think there's much more we can do through the National Collaborative Procurement that helps bodies, including local government, get better value for money in their procurement. That's just a few. There are many others. Many other areas of reform happening, but I thought those probably best to highlight.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary, and I really appreciate the comments you made about Glasgow social work there, because I think that is very relevant. Just we were talking about buildings there and such like, has been one way that resources could be better used. Do you have any thoughts on the community asset transfers that councils have got the power for? Could they be getting better used? Could they be getting used more quickly and getting more community asset transfers done?
I'm a big fan of community asset transfer where it's done well, and this isn't about offloading surplus buildings to unwilling communities. This is about a partnership where communities want to take on assets that may be underused or surplus to requirements, and there is something that's hard to explain that sometimes happens where facilities have been taken over by communities. They suddenly blossom and they suddenly take on a new lease of life because they're being run in a different way, that communities have the connections, they manage to bring people in and breathe new life into facilities, and I've seen it happen many times. It doesn't mean it's appropriate in every case, but I think we should very much be open, and that local authorities should be, and other public bodies for that matter, should be open to the idea where there is a community interest and demand and willingness, and to look at that. That should certainly be something that should be supported.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. You'll be aware as well that the committee asked for specific measures in the budget that support sector-led transformation in local government. I'm wondering if you could update us on what is in the budget that will support public service reform in councils. I appreciate that you've already touched a wee bit on this in your opening statement and previous answers, but just to give you the opportunity to elaborate a wee bit.
Well, in addition to local government's own resources, which are for them to decide how they utilise, and they very much and COSLA is very much in agreement with us about the need for reform. I would really want and encourage local government to be looking across boundaries at shared services. We've got some good examples of that, but I think it's scratching at the surface of what can be delivered with shared services across local authorities. There's quite a lot happening in the planning space in that regard because of the difficulty of attracting planning resource to some local authorities. But I think we could see far more of that shared in that shared service space. You'll be aware that we have established an Invest to Save fund of up to 30 million. Now, what I've not said is that, oh well, local government share is X, but local government is very much encouraged to bring forward proposals. We would want proposals that maximise the return on investment, that are really fundamental reforms. So we would want to see reforms that are going to be game-changing, that are really going to make a difference in the way local services are provided, and that financial sustainability is an element of that, to make sure that that services can be sustained going forward. And we're also very supportive of the single island authority model that's being that the Western Isles are the most advanced around, and that is, you know, just the simple concept. If you have a small, relatively small community that is trying to attract people to work in both the local authority and the NHS, quite often competing for the same people, particularly in management and in staff on the front line, that a single island authority model makes perfect sense. Now, there are governance issues that are being worked through, and these are not unsubstantial governance issues, particularly around the different governance for the health service as compared to a local authority, but it does show ambition. It shows ambition of thought, and that's why we're really keen to support it, because it's, you get thinking outside the box, and that's, I think, something that merits our support.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. And a final question from me, if that's okay, Convener, is around about the multi-year funding settlements. Cabinet Secretary, are you confident that the Scottish Government will be able to, from 2025, provide these multi-year funding settlements, which would, of course, assist councils to plan for the medium term?
So I'm very keen to move into a multi-year space. One of the things we need to see first, though, is the outcome of the spending review, the UK Government spending review. We're expecting both the resource and capital spending review outcomes around June. So I need to see what the envelopes are that the Scottish Government is likely to receive to then be able to make those multi-year commitments. But local government, I'm really, really keen to do so, because I think that point about reform and sustainability, it's much easier to make the changes that need to be made if you've got a line of sight of more than 1 year of budget, because you can plan those changes over well, it would be a 3-year cycle that would be reviewed every 2. And I think that was one of the better announcements that the Chancellor has made. So third sector as well, I'm very, very keen to move into that space, but the spending review outcome, I just need that assurance of knowing what the kind of broad envelopes are likely to be. And given some of the, well, what would I describe it as, uncertainty around some of the Chancellor's plans, I would want to make sure that there's no, well, that we have that certainty before making that commitment.
Okay. Thanks very much. And continuing with the theme, I'm going to bring in Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. Recognising the approval of the Visitor Levy Act, I wondered if there are other taxes that may be considered for local government to have the power to introduce if it makes sense locally and give them that flexibility.
So, you know, on principle, I am very keen to look at making sure that local government has the maximum number of levers that they can have. All of that has to be within the context of financial sustainability and affordability. But it doesn't mean that local authorities will necessarily all use some of those powers. So I think the visitor levy is a good example of where it is an option for local government. They don't have to use it, and it is an option for them to use or not use. We are consulting also on the potential for a cruise ship levy, and the programme for Government 24-25 makes clear that we're going to intensify work on designing a potential cruise ship levy. Again, that won't be for every local authority. It'll be of interest to some and more than others. The tax strategy commits to establish criteria that should be considered when determining the level of government at which a tax could be delivered, and that will allow us to consider proposals for taxation in a consistent way. And of course, the joint working group on future source of income and council tax reform is continuing to meet. In fact, we're meeting next week, and we're looking at proposals for the future of local taxation, because I think there's a desire to have a fairer system of local taxation, but trying to build political consensus around that is important. Otherwise, it's not going to get off first base in a new parliamentary session if it doesn't have a degree of parliamentary consensus. The power of general competence as well, I mentioned earlier on. We're going to be consulting on that, and again, that is the delivery of that has to be more than it has to actually mean something and be of substance to local government, rather than it just being something that is theoretical but perhaps isn't going to be used. So there's a number of areas that local government has been keen to pursue. The levy on second homes, for example, was something that local government was very keen to take forward, and again something that we have delivered within the confines of what we're able to do through secondary legislation. Going further than we have would require primary.
Second homes and cruise ships certainly have a huge impact on a lot of the councils in the Highlands and Islands. I would say another one that's near the top of the list is motorhomes. Many do see a huge negative impact there. Is the Scottish Government still open to considering how a motorhome levy could be introduced?
So while we remain open to the idea of a motorhome levy, discussions with councils and land management organisations have highlighted some quite significant issues of how it would operate in practice. And you wouldn't want to have to build up some really difficult costly administrative system. We'll consider any developed proposals that work well to support the visitor economy, but very much an early stage. But I do recognise the impact on communities and some particular local authorities, and the management of that is something that we recognise local authorities will want to receive support with. So I'm open to the concept, but discussions are in an early stage.
I've got a question on the fiscal framework. In your 4th of December letter to the committee, you stated it may be unhelpful to consider a final version of the framework to be a desirable objective. However, the Verity House agreement stated that a fiscal framework would be concluded by September 23, and you told us on October 8th last year that it was at an advanced stage. Yeah. And I'd be interested to understand what's changed since October 8th and why has this been such a lengthy process?
So first of all, let me say my intention is to get agreement with COSLA to publish the fiscal framework alongside the local government settlement next month. Now, that is if we can get agreement with COSLA. One of the issues, you guys know more of the detail about this because they've been working on it in great detail. One of the issues is around the rules-based framework. Now, what seemed like quite a straightforward thing, once you start to explore the pros and cons, it becomes anything but. So I think local government, themselves looked at the pros and cons and were quite mindful about them. So, for example, if you had a rules-based framework that was at a point in time, well, what happens if there's in-year shifts? Is that it? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't have a rule that's the rule, and then there's a change in year and there's a different set of rules. So it is, it's got a lot of pros and cons. I don't know if Eleanor, you want to come in at this stage around any?
I'm always happy to come in on the fiscal framework, Cabinet Secretary, because I think the key observation I would make is everything the Cabinet Secretary has set out today in terms of engagement reflects the fiscal framework in action. It's not just a piece of paper. It's similar to the Verity House Agreement. It's about the relationship and the investment in the time. And budget engagement, which previously used to be quite late in the fiscal cycle, is now started in April, May and carries on through the year. And a few of the issues I would reflect on from earlier discussions. Mr Alexander mentioned about just transition and climate change, and we're looking to build that into budget engagement to try and understand, develop shared evidence. Mr Griffin mentioned about the Granton project and other fiscal flexibilities. Again, we're looking to do that through the fiscal framework. So the fiscal framework is exemplified in the decisions that were set out in this year's budget, and putting that on a piece of paper shouldn't really change that relationship. But we are, as the Cabinet Secretary said, hoping to codify that towards the end of next month alongside the local government settlement. In terms of the rules-based framework, as the Cabinet Secretary said, it is a nice academic exercise, but it's hugely complicated. And I don't know, maybe 20% of today's discussion has been about employer national insurance contributions. And if we had a rules-based framework operating this year and the rule was set on the 4th of December when the budget was fixed, we wouldn't know what to, notwithstanding the uncertainty about the quantum and the decision-making, we won't know the answer till that, likely to be till main estimates of the UK government. How would you accommodate that within a rule? And that's incredibly complicated. Otherwise, you end up revisiting the rule every couple of months and you undermine the principle of simplicity and usability. And the other factors that we've experienced in this year, where we've been running it in our own heads in terms of a rules-based framework, is the timetable of which the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts are set, where there's the agreement with the Scottish Fiscal Commission about the various 4 phases of tax setting, and ultimately ministers don't really know their ultimate budget until a week or 2 before the budget, and it might not even be 2 weeks, it might be a week before the budget. Again, how are ministers meant to plan for that certainty, and how would you apply the rule when you don't know the actual quantum available until days before final decision making? So some of these complexities have been established jointly with local government. We may have a slightly different perspective on the deliverability of those, but those discussions are ongoing, but they don't really contribute to the fiscal framework. The fiscal framework is very much about the relationship. It's about joint tax powers. It's, the fiscal framework is about, if you look at the Verity House Agreement, it was about meaningful early budget engagement. It was about simplification and consolidation. And the Cabinet Secretary mentioned earlier on the £1.5 billion that's been baseline since the Verity House Agreement was settlement. It was also about multi-year certainty. Now, we've just touched upon that today, the reliance on a UK budget. And the rules-based framework doesn't actually deliver on any of those original principles. So we think the fiscal framework can stand in isolation, and I think we've evidenced that this year, hopefully. And I think that's reflected in pleasant comments from the SPICE briefing around the change in tone, the COSLA response to the budget. I think there's enough demonstrations of the fiscal framework in action that hopefully we can get that published next month.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. I mean, it strikes me that the idea of a rules-based framework is that what you said is striving for simplicity, but perhaps actually what we really need is what you've been doing, which is ongoing relationship and discussion in the long run, and that actually is more effective. It's actually, it sounds to me like there's so many changes and shifts potentially and fluctuations that actually being engaged and having a relationship with COSLA is really going to be the best thing.
Yeah, I think Ian's articulated it very well, that it's about the way we're doing business already. It's about the relationship rather than a thing.
Yeah.
And I think that I've seen many COSLA responses to the budget over the years, and I think this is probably without its challenge to us, but it's one of the most constructive and recognising what we've delivered in terms of the budget, while setting out some additional asks, obviously. But I think that is perhaps a reflection of the earlier and more meaningful budget engagement, which is part of the framework.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
and while we're talking about frameworks, could I ask for an update on the monitoring and accountability framework?
Ellen, do you want to?
Yeah, happy to, Cabinet Secretary. So the accountability and assurance framework work does continue on this. We worked jointly throughout 2024 and had some really good constructive workshops with a number of officials across local government and Scottish Government. We did have a small pause in the work in the autumn of last year as we focused our attention on the pre-budget stages, and just from a resourcing perspective had to focus our time there. But we are now moving into the next phase to complete that work and hope to be bringing forward to both ministers and leaders in the spring a prototype which can be agreed and then stood up in a transparent, published way. And it will be an iterative process as we learn from the better understanding that monitoring and accountability framework creates.
Yeah, that sounds great. Again, it's kind of difficult to sort of stand here now and understand what's going to be happening and kind of conceive those eventualities abstractly. We've got a few more questions. I'm going to bring in a couple of members. I'm going to bring in Alexandra Stewart with a very important question to us.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, we are aware of the SLARC recommendations, and I know there's been some discussion and updates. And the last time we had any indication, it was that the Scottish Government had accepted the pay and boundary changes, and they were planning, I believe, to lay regulations early in this year to bring these into effect. So it would be useful to have an update from you on the confirmation of where we are, the timings and the position of that.
Yes. So first of all, the SLARC recommendations, I think, were important, as I said the last time I was here, and recognising, if we're going to encourage people into local government, this is one part of the picture, not the whole picture, but one part. So the uplift in the general revenue grant for 25-26 ensures that implementation of the recommendations is affordable within the local government settlement. And bearing in mind, the premise that COSLA and local government do not want ring fencing, I think it would have sat at odds with that to have had that somehow ring fenced, given that they're very much against ring fencing per se. So it's within the settlement. Regulations will be laid shortly. Been confirmed for the 23rd? Yes, so this week, which will implement the pay and banding related changes that were recommended by SLARC, and that will take effect from the 1st of April. There were other recommendations relating to expenses and the introduction of a severance payment. I think they better sit with local government, but my officials are engaging with COSLA on these, because there are questions about, what would be, how would that be implemented in a fair way, and there's differing views within local government on that, so we need to work through that. So we'll make any required regulations to implement any agreed changes as and when required, but before the next planned local government elections. But the first set of regulations are this week.
Okay, so thank you for
progress.
Thanks for bringing some good news. And finally, I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher again with some questions around housing.
Thank you very much again, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, last year's budget there was a fund made available to support someone to leave an abusive relationship, and that was rolled out within 5 different council areas, being Glasgow, South Lanarkshire, North Lanarkshire, Edinburgh and Fife. I didn't hear anything about the pilot being extended in this year's budget, or indeed a full rollout. So I'm wondering if we could have an update from you on this, given the importance of the topic.
So it is a very important topic, and it's something I'm, very, very keen to support. But I think can I come back to the committee with the detail of that, because I want to make sure I'm giving you accurate information. I don't have it in front of me, so I'll come back to you on that.
That would be helpful. Thank you very much. And on the final question that I have relates to the financial memorandum of the housing bill. There was some commentary, some concerns in relation to the financial memorandum, and in particular when it comes to homelessness prevention. I think it's just under £8 million that's been earmarked for that rollout, and I'm just wondering, are you confident that that will be a sufficient amount of money to actually install this prevention element should the bill pass, or would it be the case that that number might need to be revised?
Well, I would certainly hope that would be sufficient, building on the other investments that have been made in this area. But it's something we'll keep under review, and with local government, to make sure that any issues that emerge around the funding of it are picked up very quickly. But I don't foresee any particular issues.
I think that's an important point, Cabinet Secretary, just given the financial pressures that local government's facing. But I appreciate your response there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our questions. I want to thank everyone for managing the time very well, and want to also thank the Cabinet Secretary and her officials for the evidence this morning. I think it's been very helpful to get that detail and get those updates, and I'm now going to briefly suspend business to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our inquiry into retrofitting of housing for net zero. And as mentioned in the previous session, we have 75 minutes for this discussion. So I'd be grateful if we can keep questions and answers as succinct as possible. And we're joined for this item by Dr. Alistair Allen, MSP, who's Acting Minister for Climate Action. The Acting Minister is joined by Scottish Government officials, Gareth Feeney, who's the Head of Heat Networks and Investment, Sue Cairns, who's the Deputy Director for Heat and Buildings Policy and Regulation, Ross Loveridge, who is the Head of Heat and Buildings Assessment, and Neil Lafferty, who is the Head of Heat Strategy and Consumer Policy Unit. And I welcome you all to this meeting, and I'd like to begin by inviting the Acting Minister to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to the committee for inviting me here today. In advance of this meeting, I sent a letter to you setting out our recent progress in heat and buildings, and I hope that this has been useful. We consulted last year on proposals for a heat and buildings bill, and as I set out in my letter, we are still considering the responses to our consultation. The proposals would directly affect the lives of so many across Scotland, and we must take the time necessary to consider all of the issues raised. This is especially important as, while heat and energy efficiency are devolved, as you know, progress and actions to make clean heating systems more affordable are reserved to the UK Government. We do need more certainty from the UK Government about its own plans to prohibit polluting heating systems, the potential role of hydrogen in providing heat, and proposals to make clean heating systems more affordable, such as by rebalancing gas and electricity prices. Our thinking on the bill means that we are also still considering how to take forward related proposals for a new social housing net zero standard. We plan to reconvene our stakeholder review group as soon as is practicable before publishing our response. I want to turn now briefly to reform of energy performance certificates, EPCs, the information within which the Climate Change Committee has rightly said must be reformed. This reform will be a critical step in the decarbonisation of our buildings. I am therefore pleased to confirm that the Scottish Government has published its response to the EPC reform consultation today and will lay new EPC regulations in Parliament during 2025, introducing a new rating system to come into force in 2026. Right. This system will ensure consumers have better information on how well a property retains heat and on the emissions and efficiency of its heating system, as well as redesignated and more accessible certificates. Consumers also need to be able to trust the EPC assessment process, and so the new regulations will be accompanied by tighter governance requirements to improve quality assurance. EPCs operate across the UK internal market, so we will continue to work with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to build new shared technical infrastructure. We will consult further on necessary adjustments to EPC lodgement fees to cover the costs of these changes before laying the revised regulations. I appreciate that EPC reform is technically complex, and I would therefore be happy for officials to meet with committee members and to provide an informal factual briefing to committee members following the publication of our response. Our delivery schemes continue to provide funding through grants and loans to homes and businesses to install energy efficiency measures and clean heating systems, including targeted support for those in or at risk of fuel poverty. We have allocated £1.3 billion of funding through our heat and building schemes so far this parliamentary session, excluding 25-26, and I am delighted that our 25-26 budget commitment to invest an additional invest an additional £300 million in our heat and buildings programmes. This will support over 20,000 households to save up to £500 on their energy bills each year, helping make their homes warmer and more comfortable. So, by way of conclusion, I hope that these remarks provide helpful context for members, and I am very happy to respond to questions.
Thanks very much for that. And your news about the EPC and the new rating is very welcome. I remember that being an issue when I first got elected, and I attended a talk about how this was in the works. So it's good to hear that it's actually coming forward now. I'm going to start our questions in a kind of general area, and then we'll bring in some other themes. So the Heaton Buildings Annual Progress Report noted that the emissions from buildings in 2022 were more than planned. I'd be interested to get a sense if you understand why that is the case and what you're doing to close the gap.
Well, there's a great number of measures combined that we're taking to try to ensure that emissions from buildings are brought down. We're very conscious that 20% of our carbon emissions as a country come from our buildings. We will have to address that fact if we are going to reach the ambitious targets that we all have for 2045. There are individual schemes which I'm sure the committee will want to ask about, but for instance I can think of our Heat and Buildings programme and the budget that we spend on that. I can think of the area-based schemes to improve people's energy efficiency in their houses, and the hope is that that will reduce emissions. And we have to do that, all of that, hand in hand with an effort to ensure that anything we do in this sphere does not have the unintended consequence of putting people into poverty. So those are a few of the things we're doing. I may, if I might, convener, ask officials if they want to add anything to that list. Okay.
Can I just come back? My question was more about that the emissions from buildings in 2022 were more than planned, and do you have a sense of why that was? I think it'd be quite interesting to potentially understand what the issues were there. And I understand you've got programmes and schemes, but that the gap can close, potentially that gap can be closed by those schemes. But I just wonder if you understand why we weren't making it on those emission.
Well, the targets that we have set ourselves, we're confident that we can make in the long term. But there are no doubt. There is no doubting the fact that there are challenges in the here and now. I've mentioned some of the measures that we're taking to address those, but I'll bring in officials, if I might, to talk about the figures for this year.
To pick up a bit on that point, I think one of the challenges that going year to year in the kind of the emission reduction targets for housing and the emissions that we see from it and the building stock more generally is that it responds to the weather patterns. So I don't quite recall, whether 2022 was a colder winter than the year before, but I think that often does drive a kind of a pattern of a fluctuation in the emissions, and that's something I need to go away and look at to understand that. I think, as the Minister was referring to, though, I think there's a lot of what we're seeing is kind of good work to start to make up some of that shortfall. I think we're seeing kind of the deployment of renewable heating systems kind of rise year on year. I think from 2013 we've seen it was about 1,500 heat pumps going in per annum, and I think now we're in excess of about 6,000 per annum. So I think we're seeing quite growth, and that is starting to scale, but we need to kind of start to build that. I think we are just starting to see a change in kind of public engagement and public attitudes towards it. And we've obviously seen over the last 2 years quite a lot of discourse playing out in the press and in the media around heating technologies, and I think that is just seeing that appetite and interest in the technology starting to shift is quite interesting. I think that does start to show that there is positive movement in that direction. But I think the fluctuation year on year is in part sometimes driven by changes in the seasonal pattern and the weather.
And on the point, if I may add just briefly about the weather, it's certainly something I'm very conscious of, and I'm sure other members who represent the west coast of Scotland are very conscious of, is that wind chill is a factor in all this, as well as degrees below zero, which is a fact that has sometimes been overlooked, for instance, in UK benefit system.
Okay, thanks for that. Just on the missing of the targets in 2022, what work in the building sector could help to compensate for this?
I think, for instance, the fact that we are now, and we're ahead of the rest of the UK on this, that we are in a position where new builds will not have gas or oil boilers in them. The fact that we have, as I say, intervened in area-based schemes and elsewhere to reduce acute situations and fuel poverty as part of it. And the fact that we're producing an EPC system which for the first time will give people a clear idea not only of the cost of heating their house but also of its environmental impact. I think all of these things are a good place to start, and also it's a good way to engage the public. I've said in the past, and many others have said, that no government can do this on their own. We are looking at transforming the way that we heat our houses in Scotland.
Yeah. Yeah, so we need to bring everybody along with us. I think we've got some questions about that coming up. I just wanted to move into the Heat and Buildings Bill itself. And in your letter, you stated that the timing of the introduction and the nature of a Heat and Buildings Bill are still under consideration. I'd be interested to understand if the proposed timescales set out in the consultation are still realistic given the current progress on the legislation, and how does this provide clarity and certainty for industry and others to move forward on the delivery?
Well, I appreciate the point that you make about the need for certainty amongst industry and consumers. I think one of the things that's significant about the bill is the scale of the response and the complexity of the response. We've had 1,600 responses to the consultation, raising many complex themes, and I mentioned one of them, which is about the need to ensure that everything we do avoids putting people into poverty. We need to have a diverse approach, a flexible approach that takes account of the very diverse building types, as you're aware, across Scotland, and also needs to engage with the reality that many of the really big decisions that we await are still awaited from Westminster. I mentioned one of them about the relative price of gas and electricity, which is central to this as well. That's not going to mean that we don't look very carefully through the responses and work as we are working on it, but those are all relevant factors.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm just going to pick up another question here, because you mentioned the UK government's in the letter to us. I'd be interested to and you also mentioned it in your opening statement, but I'd be interested to understand if you could provide more detail on what decisions you need from the UK government to progress the legislative plans. What indication has the UK government given about its planned timing of those decisions, and how dependent are your plans for the introduction of the bill on that UK government timing?
Well, I should be clear that we await important information from the UK government, and we have a good conversation with them. I'm not suggesting that the timing of decisions about the bill are based on anything that we're awaiting at the moment. But these decisions are nonetheless relevant. There is a conversation, as you're aware, going on about electricity pricing, the relative price of electricity and gas, REMA, the reform of many parts of the network, and the decisions that the UK government take will clearly interact with their own legislation. But I'll bring in others to talk about some of those conversations.
Yeah, so the UK government obviously holds more powers than we do, and those powers very notably around rebalancing electricity and gas prices. That's the key decision, I think, for heat decarbonisation. That obviously there's lots of stuff that we're doing and thinking of doing around on the regulatory side. These, if you like, as an ex-colleague once said, were our sticks. The UK government holds a lot of the carrots, if you like, to induce or to encourage people to change their heating. And rebalancing gas and electricity prices is a key one here. And if you can get prices down, I think there's some research showing that, yes, electricity is 4 times the price of gas per unit, but actually if you can get it down to about 3.6 times the price of gas even, that will make electrical heating cheaper to run. So, that's not much of a decrease, but actually that could make a big difference. Those kind of things sit with the UK government. Decision on hydrogen for heating, whether that is something that is feasible. We think it might be feasible sort of in niche situations in Scotland, so we need to understand what the UK government's doing about that. And also looking at whether they are what they're going to do in around phasing out gas boilers. The past UK government had a plan, I think it was saying, for no more sales of gas boilers after 2035. The current government is not, as far as we can see, so it's making noises to suggest that that's no longer the case. So given they do have the net zero targets themselves, obviously for the UK overall, what are their plans for actually making that change from gas heating? So these are really significant things that I think will make it's the wider context around heat decarbonisation We really need to know the answers on that, and we are talking to them and engaging quite positively, I have to say, at the moment.
Okay.
I'll bring in Neil, if I may, Convener, and just to add to what's been said there, one of the things that I often find myself talking about in, as I say, very constructive terms to my UK counterparts is about Scotland's urban landscape and the distinctive tenement landscape which we have. And I quite often find myself visiting colleges where people who are training to become heating engineers point out to me all the different options they feel they might have in Scotland's tenements where the price of electricity rebalanced with the price of gas. So this does have a practical impact on our urban landscape.
I was just going to echo briefly the point Sue made about the importance of the decisions and a consultation potentially on the relative prices of electricity and gas, again in the context of the bill and the timing of its introduction, because our assessment of the costs of the various measures that the bill may contain is going to be hugely dependent on decisions and progress in areas like that. So it is one of the reasons why we're assessing things as carefully as we are.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher with a question in this area.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Can you give us a general comment on the reaction to the consultation on the Heat and Buildings Bill and the work that's been undertaken on developing those proposals before it comes to Parliament?
Well, I wouldn't like to try and preempt any government response, but I do appreciate the point that you're making, and certainly a lot of work is going in just now at official level into analysing, as I say, those 1,600 responses. I mean, some of the things that are foremost in the government's mind, and this isn't to preempt anything that we say, is about, as I mentioned, responding to the diverse housing types that exist, and responding to the need to ensure that everything we do is, if you like, poverty-proof, to make sure that it addresses, rather than by any inadvertent means exacerbates fuel poverty. Obviously 31% of people, as you're aware, in Scotland are assessed as being in fuel poverty, 18% in severe fuel poverty, and those numbers are much higher in rural areas. So these are at the forefront of our mind, but we have had good quality responses. I've mentioned already the need for conversations with the UK Government on some issues, but without trying to preempt what the Government says by way of its response, I hope that gives a flavour of the things that are important to us.
No, thank you very much for that. Were there any areas of contention to note?
Well, I may refer you on to the people who are ploughing their way through the consultation responses as we speak. I've mentioned some of them. I think a lot of the people who've been in touch are keen to ensure that what we do has flexibility in it and takes account of fuel poverty, as I've mentioned. But I'll bring in others to talk about some examples, possibly, of the issues that have been brought to us.
I think all the responses are online, so they have been published, so you can look at those, and the analysis of the responses will be coming. So basically, I think if you summed it up in one line, I think overall the reaction was positive to the consultation, but the devil's in the detail. I think that's kind of summing it up. And some of the detail that the devil's in is around the need for financial support through grants and subsidies, the expense of changes that could be made, fuel poverty issues, as the Minister's already said, the risk of the increase to fuel poverty if we get the proposals wrong, and the feasibility, the practicality of making these changes because of the diverse stock. So it's all the kind of things that we've mentioned already, and looking at exemptions and flexibility in what we do so that it's not one size fits all. I think that's probably a fair summary.
It's quite interesting that private landlords wasn't mentioned in that mix because, of course, we know, as it stands just now, with the targets set to 2028 in relation to EPCC, roughly around 50% haven't achieved EPC targets as yet. Now, I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, Minister, about looking at EPC and a new system that would likely come in 2026, all being well and approved. However, what happens to the 50% of landlords who have already invested to get themselves to EPCC standards already? And will there be a new target for landlords who have not yet managed to reach that target?
Okay, there are a lot of very important points in that. Firstly, many of the responses do come from private landlords. We do, as a government, acknowledge the importance of that sector, and you rightly point to the fact that there would need to be work done in that sector as in other sectors in the future. It's important to say that the revised EPCs, to come back to them, do not of themselves mandate people to do things in terms of making it possible or impossible, for instance, to sell properties. But it is important for the private rented sector, since you mentioned them, that we get EPCs right, both from the point of view of the landlord and the tenant. So one of the reasons, for instance, that we are proposing moving from a 10-year EPC to a 5-year EPC is to introduce a bit of equality for people in that sector so that the consumer has more up-to-date information. We are also keen to ensure that there's a conversation goes on with the private rented sector in the context of another bill for which I am not directly responsible around investment in housing. But yes, the EPC highlights, I suppose, the fact that 50% of the private rented sector will need to be improved in the future if it's to meet the targets that we set ourselves around energy efficiency. Compared to, I think, about 65% of the social rented sector already meets that target.
So I'm a bit concerned here in terms of what we're saying, because we know that through the other bill, the housing bill, rents are going to be capped. Through this bill, private landlords will therefore have to fork out even more money to get up to the energy standards that are required. So what we're effectively doing to smaller landlords is either forcing them out the market completely, or we're going to try and bankrupt them with the amount of money that they're going to have to put up in order to become energy efficient within the homes. And particularly with rural housing, reaching the EPC target as it stands is incredibly difficult. So I'm wondering, what is the overall strategy here? Because we are in a housing emergency. And if, for example, you look at the housing stock in relation to private landlords, what is going to happen if we keep on putting on these measures, putting more pressure onto them and forcing them out the market completely?
Well, as I say, I can't really answer questions here directly about the housing bill. You need to bring in another minister to do that. But you do raise important questions, and I think the government is very alive to the need to have that balance there, so that tenants have rights, consumers have rights, but investment goes into the system. And I think that's the focus of that legislation. But as I say, the purpose of new EPCs is not of themselves to force or to require by law of themselves landlords or others to make changes. But we do hope that it will assist people in moving towards that. And I think ultimately it's in everyone's interest that people in Scotland, whether they are house owners or whether they are private or social tenants, are warm and healthy. And we do have work to do to get to that point. But as I say, the purpose of the EPC is to provide information to people. And I think it's right that potential tenants of a private landlord are aware how warm their house is likely to be.
I can come in if you like and say, we are very much alive to the risk of cumulative impacts between any regulation on the heat and building side, beyond EPCs, which, as the Minister said, is just to provide information. But if you were to use them in any way, in any further regulation on heat and buildings, we're alive to the risk of cumulative impacts of that on private sector landlords because of the housing bill. So we are actively engaging with our housing colleagues to make sure that we can bring the two sides together and make sure that if we do introduce further regulation on the heating building side, that there is alignment there.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Just while we were going to come on to EPC later, but given it's already up in the air and being discussed, I just wanted to get a sense of how you're going to ensure that consumers are going to be aware of the new system and have the confidence in the assessment process.
I think confidence is very important, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're not just changing the information available to people, but also seeking means to make sure that the information is accurate and to eliminate anything fraudulent from the system. So we are, for instance, as I mentioned, bringing EPCs down from 10 years to 5 years to make them more accurate. But we're also, as I mentioned earlier on, introducing measures for tighter governance arrangements around EPCs and also around the competence and training of EPC assessors operating in Scotland. And I think legitimate concerns were raised to make sure that we do both of those things.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I've got another one. I'm wondering if anything came up in the consultation around damp and mould, because I think there's been quite a bit of concern around start moving to fabric first approach, or I've heard horrific stories of people in my region who get insulation done by people who are not potentially properly certified and left with situations where actually that just increases the damp and mould. So I wonder if you're taking that into account.
We are, and that is an important point as well, because one of the things that we'll be seeking to do through this are not merely to provide, and I'll mention them, the 3 areas of broad information that we're proposing, but also bringing in an interface that would allow a technical assessment of individual properties to avoid unintended situations where people take measures that make their houses damper. And I'll bring in others who may be able to talk about that. But the 3 areas that the EPC itself would cover would be heating system rating, which would allow consumers to compare the emissions, thermal efficiency and running costs. Heat retention rating, which is a new rating and is a direct measure of how well the building holds heat. And then energy cost rating, which is the focus of the current EPC. But I'll bring in others to talk about some of the additional technical offers that are made to avoid the situation that you describe.
Yeah, thanks, Minister, and morning, members of the committee. Thanks for that question, Convener. I think it's a well understood risk that we do not want to see the wrong sorts of measures installed in buildings. Damp, condensation, we hear things about spray foam insulation in lofts. You'll have seen a lot about that in the media over the autumn. We've been very clear in the government response that the Minister has issued today to the EPC reform consultation that we heard loud and clear from stakeholders the importance of ensuring that EPCs provide that basic standardised assessment for all properties. But they can never give you the level of technical competence that can compare a croft on a Scottish island with, a modern detached house in Glasgow. And so it's really important that we're able to work with the industry to drive up standards around retrofit assessment. So that means looking at the technical suitability assessment, which was part of the consultation on the Heat in Buildings Bill. And as the Minister said, we're still considering a response to that. But just to be clear, that process would be about ensuring that building owners had bespoke technical advice about which measures were actually suitable, precisely to avoid the sort of things that you say, like damp or mould.
So just for clarity, are we saying that every home in Scotland is going to have its own technical assessment done? Is that the idea?
The consultation was on the basis that would be available in circumstances where it might be needed, particularly in the context of proposed mandatory standards or for eligibility for government funding schemes. Yeah. But, for example, at the moment, I think 40% of homes don't have an EPC because they've not been sold or let, people who just remain in the same property. There's no trigger for that. So we'd have to think about that around, the impacts of when it was appropriate to make sure that people had that additional information if that was necessary.
I think that's welcome. It's certainly something that I've heard people in the sector calling for, that kind of thing, where every home has its own assessment. Yeah, like MOT or something. Okay, I'm just going to come back to a question I asked earlier. I didn't quite get an answer, and of course it's in the committee's interest. Just trying to get a sense of the proposed timescales on the Heat and Buildings Bill. Any clues?
I can really only say that the government hasn't reached any kind of decision about a timescale that I can give you today, other than to say that we are working our way through the consultation. I've mentioned some of the issues that are important that we get right and some of the unintended consequences that we avoid. But I can't give you a timescale beyond that, no.
Okay. We'll be knocking on your door continually. I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin on the theme of social housing.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I just wondered what you can do, what government can do to ensure that RSLs have clarity on the new requirements for social housing, give them that ability to plan for the investment required, and that's against the backdrop of the regulators' concerns about a lack of financial planning on decarbonisation.
Again, important issues. I mean, I mentioned earlier on that very nearly 2/3 of social housing in Scotland is in EPC band C or better. We appreciate the scale of the task ahead, nonetheless, and that's why the consultation proposed around the Scottish social housing net zero consultation proposed the prohibition of polluting systems by 2045. I do understand that social landlords have made representations, and I'm aware about the cost burden. The Scottish Government is committed to delivering vital support through the Social Housing Net Zero Heat Fund, and we have been supporting social landlords to retrofit houses for some time through that. And the budget proposals announced, as I say, offer £300 million in funding for the heat and building programme more generally across sectors.
I wonder if they've done any modelling on those targets to replace polluting systems as to how that would impact on tenants' rent, and the balance between government intervention, government support, and the balance of the investment paid through rent by individuals.
Well, we're conscious of that issue, and as I say, we're trying to address or avoid that scenario that you set out there, at the same time as addressing fuel poverty, and at the same time as making houses more sustainable in the way that they're heated. We as a government do recognise that the sector is under increasing pressure, not least due to the cost of living crisis and the additional cost of building and retrofitting houses. That's why the Social Housing Net Zero Heat Fund is there. It is important that we keep rents affordable in this sector. All landlords, be they private or social, do have a responsibility to ensure that, and the Scottish Government is working with them to make sure that's the case. I'll bring in others just now if they want to say more about the engagement that we've had with the social landlord sector.
Yeah, absolutely, Minister. We do work very closely with the sector, always have. We co-produced the proposals for consultation on the standard, working with a review group taken from across the sector. We are very clear on the concerns and the questions that you described and that the sector has, and which we know about. We have been doing a lot of work across a range of issues raised in response to the consultation, but also on costs and future finance and how the investment in retrofitting social housing can be achieved. We've been doing work not just with the sector, but also with Scottish Futures Trust, looking at options in that space. And when we publish our response on next steps, we'll be a little bit clearer about some of the outcomes and outputs from that work.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
We're now going to move into delivery schemes and funding, and I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. When we're looking at the setting of targets and the funding strategies that we've had, between 2021-22 and 23-24, 575 million of the 1.3 billion for energy efficiency and decarbonisation for buildings was spent. So my question is, why has the budget been underspent by over 40%?
Well, as you mentioned, we've allocated 1.3 billion for funding. I think the elephant in the room there is obviously that some months ago the Scottish Government, to be candid, faced quite a task in terms of reaching what was euphemistically called a path to balance. Now, we're in a better position now, but there was a point when it was not simple or straightforward to get to that point, and the member you'll be very well aware why. But we have, as I say, committed that money, and we are confident that we are going to make use of that money. I think it's important to say too that much of that money has been committed for energy, or all of that money has been committed for energy and efficiency projects, which will have a direct benefit on people in terms of addressing both fuel poverty and making their houses more sustainable.
Okay. And when we look at the budget coming forward for 25-26, you've once again allocated £349 million for energy efficiency and decarbonisation. So you've already indicated that the money that hasn't been spent previously, but you're going to try and continue to fund and spend the money that was left. And you've allocated another £349 million going forward. So how will the money be spent to achieve the maximum effect on how we can ensure that the budget is fully spent? Because that, at the end of the day, Minister, is what we're trying to achieve. You can allocate funding, but if it's not used and then you reallocate more, it's how effective that's going to be at ensuring that we can fully spend the sums of money that you're allocating.
Well, it is important that we spend the money in a way that is effective. So our 2025-26 budget commits, as you mentioned, over £300 million in heat and buildings programmes. And to answer your questions about how we make that effective, this includes supporting over 20,000 households to save up to £500 on their energy bills a year to make their houses healthier and more comfortable. And I do think that that is an effective use of public money, and I think it's one I would strongly defend. I think it's also worth pointing to other schemes like the area-based schemes, which concentrate money on areas of fuel poverty, or spend within that, rather, on area-based schemes. And the fact that that includes allocating an extra £20 million to Warmer Homes, taking its budget to £85 million, which is the highest budget that we've spent in that area before.
And can I just add to that? Sure. The other elephant in the room is COVID, I would say, from the earlier underspend, and most of our schemes are demand-led, so they would rely on that demand coming forward, and that, to a large degree, was why there's been an underspend in previous years. But now that the momentum has built within those schemes and actually are doing really well, and we expect, Gareth can correct me if I'm wrong, we expect to do very well in getting the money out of the door this year. So it's about building that interest. And some of the schemes were on early feasibility studies and so on, and they've come through in a pipeline. These things take time, particularly on the heat network side and so on. So it's a longer term thing, but the trajectory is certainly going in the right direction. Okay.
Yes, and just to reiterate that, both the difficulty in actually working during COVID was a factor, but also the actual cost of materials in the wake of COVID was a deterrent to many contractors.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and your colleagues. I wonder if I could ask a few questions about heat pumps and associated technologies. We know that the target is way behind what we had hoped for, and you've explained some of the reasons why there. And I think Gareth made a comment earlier that I think we managed 6,000 new heat pumps last year. I'm interested in what they are, whether they're conversions from people that have had gas to heat pumps, or whether they're new builds, or and so on. So I wonder if, Gareth, could you give us a flavour of just what that picture looks like for the moment?
Okay. Sorry, I'll bring you in. Thank you. The figures I've got here for heat pump annual installations are 2019, 2,448, 2020, 2,993, 2021, 4,667, 2022, 5,146, 2023, 6,388. So the importance of heat pumps towards the efforts that we're making to decarbonise and improve Scotland's housing stock are increasingly significant as the years go by.
But the quantity we were originally hoping for was 1 million conversions in 10 years. It's a huge transformation. It was roughly 100,000 a year. So we're nowhere near that.
My predecessor, Patrick Harvey, made clear that that particular target was not achievable, and I think it's as well that, and I would agree with Mr Harvey on this, it's as well that government comes to Parliament and presents targets that are achievable, and it's not honest to do anything else.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think the catalyst for the complete transformation actually is, Minister? For me, it seems to be the price. I mean, people in private sector housing are looking at the price of this. It's 4 times. Electricity is 4 times the price of gas. So they're essentially making a decision based on that. But are they also making the decision based on trust? Trusted partners, who can they trust on the systems that are being recommended to them? Where can they see these working? Where is the evidence that would enable people to make the transformation? So are those 2 factors crucial in your view to try to solve that, to get the transformation working at a better pace?
Well, on the first point about trust, I think I'm going to deal in anecdotes here, which ministers should never do, but I think it's very clear that from the newer generation of heat pumps in particular, there is much greater public trust, and increasing public trust in the technology as it develops. And I can see that, and I'm sure other members have seen that from people who have had heat pumps installed in their houses. I was recently visiting that house where, in my own constituency, where one had been visited, and a very discerning pensioner tenant who turned out to have been a plumber in his previous life offered a very high rating indeed. But I think the point about ensuring that people feel supported more generally, the Scottish Government has obviously got the HES grant and loan scheme, up to £7,500 grant to install a heat pump, and same amount in loan, plus a £1,500 uplift for remote, rural and island areas. So these are all tangible measures of support for people in that situation. And also, as I say, it's important to add that we can point to evidence that shows heat pumps are 3 times more efficient than oil boilers, for instance. So people can see the benefit.
And in terms of the great catalyst that will get this transformation turning substantially, is it price or is it reliability and trustworthy? Is it both?
Well, I think all of those are important, as you mentioned. I mentioned how reliability and public approval of the technology has climbed, and people are more and more confident about it. I think it's also important to say, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, that no government can do this on its own. So government can provide the catalyst, it can provide support, it can provide grants, it can provide loans. What it cannot claim to do, and no government, I don't think anywhere in Europe would be claiming to do, would be to take on all responsibility for people replacing heating systems forevermore. What it can do, as I say, is provide encouragement and support and make sure that the technology is advanced and out there, and that people who need it are helped. But I can bring in others just now if they want to add to that.
Do you see a role for the local authorities, Minister, in being able to step in here to be that established, trusted partner? Because I know from my constituents who ask me about this, they're not sure who to turn to get this transformation done in their home. Sometimes companies come and go, as you know. So there is an element there of risk that local people are saying to me they're unsure to take that step forward. Could the local authorities have a role here to play in being that long-established trusted partner to get involved in the heat, for example, the heat pump transformation programme that we hope for? And could they reach out to offer that service to the private sector residents, do you think?
I think local authorities do have a very important role, particularly they already do through things like the area-based schemes. And you point to an equally important issue. Well, sorry, I'll finish my point about local authorities, or local companies rather. I think people are very keen to have somebody locally they can go back to if things need fixed, a point of contact. And I suppose that brings us into probably some of the criticism that there has been in the past of the way the eco schemes have been operated in the past. These are not Scottish Government schemes. These are schemes that were funded at a UK level through industry. And I think you may be alluding to that, where there was significant criticism of some of the companies who were involved in installations under that scheme. But it's important that we maintain public confidence, that we try to make clear to the public that the Scottish Government's funded schemes are not the eco schemes, and that some of the well publicised problems that were associated with those schemes in the past are not the Scottish Government's area of activity.
Okay. In terms of other potential schemes, what are the alternatives for people to choose? I mean, are all our eggs in the heat pump basket, or are there other technologies that people can find out about and deploy and decide whether they're appropriate for their home?
Well, I'll bring in officials to try and give a comprehensive list, but obviously there are many other types of technology, ground source heat pumps, for instance, although those will not be suitable for every single house. Some people are in a position to have solar or small-scale wind energy, but in the future there's not going to be one single solution. Heat pumps will not be suitable for every house. And I've mentioned that, in my view, in the future, if we had rebalancing of gas and electricity prices, then we would be able to electrify houses in all sorts of other ways that are not perhaps cost-effective at the moment. But I'll bring in others. No doubt forgotten some forms of heating.
That is, I guess, there's a broad range of technologies that could be kind of picked up. I think the Minister's mentioned the wide array of electric heating. So I guess we're all familiar with storage heaters. They're much more advanced and sophisticated than the ones that we remember. So that's one option. I think heat networks, so district heat networks and communal heat networks, that's another option. I think we'll probably see much more of in our denser urban areas, but also in kind of the denser kind of rural towns and villages as well. They have potential in. So I think heat networks will play an increasing role. And obviously heat pumps and the bioenergy in some areas where that makes sense to continue to deploy bioenergy, where you need that slightly higher temperature to run the property. So I think there will be a spectrum of different heat technologies out there. And I think we need to guide kind of consumers through that. Obviously there's the National Advice Service, Home Energy Scotland, which provides that kind of free and impartial advice. That's digital, but also kind of over-the-phone advice as well. And as you say, local government can help guide, and the local heat and energy efficiency strategies help to start kind of do some of that initial planning from a local government perspective of what is the best technology for a given place based upon building characteristics, density, etc. And that can help guide individuals' decision-making as well at that more local and building level.
Okay. And lastly, from me, Alistair, the UK's clean heat market mechanism, could you just clarify, does that apply to Scotland as well? I think it's a requirement to balance the number of heat pump installations per gas installations at the moment to try and improve the transformational pace of change. So will that apply to us, and is that something you welcome?
Yes, yes, it's certainly welcome. From memory, it's 6% of installations is the figure that I think has been quoted, and yes, it would apply across the UK.
Okay. Thanks for that. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. Just before I bring in Mark Griffin with another question, I just want to ask, so Willie talked about the local authorities being an established partner, but have you given any thought to the climate action networks and hubs that the government funds? They're kind of in the community. Could you see them being a vehicle for catalysing more people taking that step?
Yes, the government has supported the establishment of a number of these. I was visiting one in, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it was either Musselburgh or Portobello, but I'm going to get that wrong and offend people along the whole coastline of East Lothian. And it was very clear from that visit that what these hubs are able to do is draw together different interests within the community. They're able to push government and other agencies. They're able to activate people to think about wider environmental issues. So yes, the Scottish Government is very happy to support them in what they do.
Okay, thanks. And another quick question around Home Energy Scotland. Is that advice service sufficiently resourced? Because I've certainly had contact from constituents where there's been kind of challenging communication situations where the grant and loan scheme people have taken up the grant and loan scheme, but communication has been slow, which has led on difficulties of getting installations happening because the money isn't coming. Because there's quite a kind of timely thing where you want your the installer needs to come, but they need to get paid and all of those kinds of things. Do you feel that they're sufficiently resourced and well enough trained to kind of do the rollout that needs to happen?
Well, the government's funded that particular service for over 15 years, and it's the Energy Saving Trust administers the Home Energy Scotland Advice Service on our behalf. Demand for that service has been high, although it has decreased from the 138,000 households supported in 2022 to 23. But as a government, we're certainly committed to ensuring that funding is applied to make sure that advice service exists in the future. And the grant is something that the Scottish Government reviews regularly to ensure that that happens.
Okay, thanks very much. Mark, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I just wanted to talk about costings for decarbonisation and whether that figure has been updated at all. The Heat and Building Strategy had estimated that the cost of decarbonising homes would be around £33 billion. So just to see if there has been any work within government to reassess that estimate in light of inflation and comments from the Just Transition Commission, who have said that they think it could cost 3 times that amount.
Yes, so the figure that you quote there, Mark, £33 billion estimate comes from our heat and building strategy, and updating that to reflect inflation and increased costs would mean that that's the equivalent of £45 billion in 2023 prices. The other figure that you refer to there from the Just Transition Commission doesn't reflect our proposed approach to decarbonising heating, particularly the role of heat networks. Heat networks do not seem to be factored into that figure. But Scottish Government's officials have met with the Just Transition Commission to discuss the basis that they have for their figures. And the cost of heat transition, it's fair to say, as I've indicated earlier on, will be substantial, although we don't accept it would be the £130 billion figure for Scotland that was quoted.
Thank you.
Much. And staying online, I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor with a few questions.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and officials. Wanted to ask Minister about the progress of the Green Heat Finance Task Force and the kind of alternative funding mechanism you're considering. I wonder if you can tell us a wee bit more about that. And just to bring some of my questions together, are you also able to detail the headlines from their new report and what timescales you're working to for responding to the task force's work?
Yes, well, these are all important questions, and as we've touched on a couple of times, all of us, the transition, financing that transition will be something that has to involve everyone, and Scotland has to involve householders, landlords, has to involve government and many other agencies. But the Independent Green Heat Finance Task Force has been considering all of that and considering particularly how private finance can support that transition. And this spring we will respond to recommendations from the task force on all of that. As I mentioned, our 2025-26 budget also commits to investing over £300 million to helping households save in the here and now. But for the future, we're keen to get advice about private finance for individuals as well.
Thanks, Minister. Can I ask then as well, in light of the Scottish Government's plans to reset its climate ambitions via the 5-year carbon budgets, can you set out whether you expect the level of ambition for emission reductions in heat and building to be reduced as a result of these changes then?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch you. Which changes are you referring to, sorry?
The changes through the carbon budgets and through the task force.
Well, the change to a system of carbon budgets is one that there was consensus around, I think, across most of the political spectrum about the need to, perhaps not all of it, but most of it, the need to ensure that the targets that the Scottish Government was putting forward were achievable and meaningful. But that doesn't alter the fact that we're committed to ensuring, too, that we get the best advice on how to ensure that there are green finance options for individuals, for homeowners to get to a position where those targets or where those budgets become possible. But I'm going to bring in others about that to see if they can add anything to that.
Well, just that we expect to get that advice from the Climate Change Committee this spring on carbon budgets, so we'll take it from there, and obviously that advice will cover across the different sectors under the climate change plan, and the heat and buildings will be part of that.
Okay. Thanks,
Okay, thanks. I just want to come back in on that final question, because Fulton did ask, is it going to have an impact, so that move to 5-year carbon budgets, is it going to have an impact on the expected level of ambition on emissions reductions through heat and buildings, which you mentioned, right, 20% of our emissions come from housing. So is this shift of how we measure it going to have an impact, do you think, or is it just kind of you're just going to keep going with what you're doing?
Well, will it have an impact on what we want for 2045? The answer to that is no. I mean, we want to do this in a way that is achievable and to have figures that are meaningful, but that doesn't take away from what our ambitions are for 2045. And the point that was made about green heat finance, the Green Heat Finance Task Force has been considering how to foster a greater flow of private finance, which would help achieve that very aim.
Okay. Great, thanks very much. And finally, we're going to move into delivery issues, and I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey with a number of questions in that area.
Thanks again, Convener Alistair. Just a few questions from me to wrap up. In your letter to the committee, you told us 27 of the 32 authorities have published their local heat and energy efficiency strategies. Some haven't. Have you got any indication about why we don't have a complete set, as it were? What's happening there?
It's difficult to tell if they haven't responded to us or haven't given us the information, but have they given us, I'll have to ask officials if they've given reasons for that.
A mix of issues. Some of it is delays in resourcing, consultancy, access, etc. So I think it's just in part access problems in terms of the resource available. We have provided ongoing funding to help resource local authorities to deliver the LHEs, and I think we're now certainly maybe received 30 of the 32 in draft, so I think we're making progress. So they're certainly they're coming through, and we're hopeful that they'll be finished.
Okay, great. In terms of what we do have then, and what we do know, are the submissions from the authorities chime in with the aims and direction of travel for the government, and do you see that cooperation being very much at the heart of their own strategies for progressing this work?
Well, we're working with local authorities to ensure that those aims are met. So we continue to support local authorities in delivering their strategies. We've funded, for instance, Zero Waste Scotland to provide capacity building support to help them to do that. And we're working to align what we do as a government with local authorities through their own delivery plans. For instance, our own heat network support unit is working with local authorities. And as I say, we would look forward in the future to seeing local authorities entirely decarbonise. We realise we have to work with them to achieve that.
Thank you for that. And on heat networks themselves, you mentioned them earlier, and the Cabinet Secretary gave an example, I think, of Glasgow being perhaps ahead of the game and doing some really good work in establishing heat networks and the levering in private sector investment to help us on this journey. Could you just maybe say a wee bit more about where we are across Scotland with heat networks and so on?
Well, we've set ourselves targets for 2027, 2030 and 2035. The statutory targets are there to provide a signal and to assist the sector, the private sector, and to provide greater certainty for investors. We're very committed to working with and encouraging projects of this kind. We offer grant support for the construction of new zero direct emission heat networks, and we are providing funding and advice as well during pre-capital stages of development to bring a pipeline of projects. I mean, that pipeline of projects is obviously important so that the sector has greater certainty and has the signals it needs to invest in the future.
Mm-hmm. She mentioned that the cities and the bigger towns maybe have an advantage over the smaller communities in establishing. Is there a balancing act there in terms of funding support that you have to think about to encourage it to be wider and across perhaps rural parts and smaller communities in Scotland too?
Well, there are obviously some communities, as you say, that perhaps lend themselves more to that particular solution than others. In my own constituency, large parts of it where there are some houses that are half a mile from each other or greater. A lot of them are half a mile from each other in some cases, some parts of my constituency. Obviously, some areas like that don't perhaps lend themselves to some solutions, although there's plenty other sustainable forms of heating that they do meet that requirement. But obviously, if there are areas that we can concentrate on, we do look to other countries. Everyone looks to Copenhagen as the example where a huge proportion of the population in that very urban area are looking to heat networks. I've met certainly with a number of the companies involved to offer what encouragement we can and to give as much certainty as we can about investment in the future.
Okay. And lastly, from me on this, public engagement. It's the crucial aspect of public engagement and bringing the public along, making them aware of what's available to them and the support they can get. Are you confident that that's as good as it can be, or are you planning to do any more work to give the public more and better information to enable them to make the choices that they'll have to make?
Well, we're always looking to provide more support and more information. If I can think of one example of that, for instance, the van that we have going around Scotland, providing advice and support and assistance to small companies who want to get involved in the installation of heat pumps, for instance, going out to many of the rural areas that I mentioned, and making sure that there's information in that sector and in those businesses. In terms of the wider public, I think that, yes, much of this is about awareness raising. It's about information about the facts of, for instance, what newer form or different forms of heating your house can do. It's about providing clearer information through EPCs, and it's about all the other efforts that I've been talking about today. Ultimately, this is a shared enterprise between government, business, householders, and all three of those have to, and landlords, all four of those have to combine when it comes to getting information out there.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Willie. Willie, are you actually talking about the air source heat pump van, which I'm well aware of, has brought up a couple other questions in my mind. So you talked earlier about Scotland having a really diverse type of housing, and certainly in the rural areas, but actually in Edinburgh as well, we've got a lot of historic buildings. And I wonder how you handle that, because we've learned here in the committee around the Fabric First approach that that's what we need to be doing, but then we've got that balance where we need to actually preserve areas where there's conservation. And something that I'm particularly concerned about is how do we get that traditional building skills into the mix, where we actually need to keep that vernacular of a community's, their buildings.
No, I'd be very supportive of that. And I know that colleagues, I think Angus Robertson has mentioned this in the context of Historic Scotland about promoting skills, whether it be stonemasons or people who can slate traditional roofs, are very important indeed, and quite a lot of effort has gone into that, I think, quite successfully. I suppose the other side to that, again, is about making sure that the information, again, I come back to EPCs, takes account of whether it's vernacular or unusual building types. And there has been some work going on to try and ensure we do just that. So with your permission, I might bring in somebody who can tell us a bit more about where that fits into EPCs, the point that you've made.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. And I think that was similar to the point I was making earlier to you, Convener, about the development of a technical suitability assessment. So that is, as the Minister says, working with Historic Environment Scotland and other experts in that field to be clear about what are the appropriate retrofit assessments that we would have, where you want that more technical advice, because, as we said, it's about getting it right for historic buildings that have got, stone walls, traditional roofing, etc., and making sure that we're not fitting the wrong measures. So we see that as complementary to the EPC reforms that we would be introducing, because EPCs ultimately, you need to have a standardised piece of information that can enable somebody buying a house in Shetland or somebody buying a house in Stranraer to make a reasonable comparison, but that's not a substitute for that bespoke technical assessment, and that's certainly something we're working hard on now.
Okay, and just the reason I mentioned the air source heat pump ban was because there's one idea that's been proposed to me around actually creating some kind of ban, I think bigger, more like an articulated lorry. Apparently they've got them in Canada, where the kind of equipment, not necessarily stone masonry, but leading and slating and that kind of thing, could be taken to rural and island communities, so that if we're going to, what we're very well aware from this committee is we don't have enough people who have the skills to build the houses, but also to retrofit. So just how do we get that? I'm kind of interested in the idea of taking the skills training out to people some concerns that have been raised to me is that young people want to get involved, but they don't want to necessarily travel to Kent to get that training that they need for something very specific.
Well, I can't comment on the example from Canada. I mean, certainly in the example from Scotland that I mentioned, I did meet a business in Shetland who had made use of it when I was in Shetland, and they pointed out that one of the huge advantages for a small builders firm or for a small contractors in an island setting is that potentially you're facing putting your staff up in a hotel or somewhere for a week, yep, just to attend 3 or 4 days worth of a course. And so the advantage to small contractors in Ireland and other very rural areas of having a remote van, I think, is very, very considerable.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great to know that you're aware of it. And it's also good to hear that Angus Robertson's been talking about that, and maybe I'll take that forward with him. But another thing that's of interest is the so we talk about the empty homes in Scotland and bringing them back on board as a way of addressing our housing emergency. And I know that's not your area, but I wonder if there is scope where we bring those houses back on board that we're actually retrofitting them before we put people in them. Is that something that you've been thinking about?
I can't comment on. I don't have a detailed knowledge of that area of housing policy, but I mean I do know anecdotally that certainly when local authorities have had empty homes officers, for instance, that they have been taking a fabric first and a heating first approach to making sure that houses are sustainably insulated and heated before they're then let out. So I think that is integrated into those efforts that are made between government and local authorities, but I'm afraid I couldn't offer much detail on that.
Okay. But that's very helpful that you are aware of that as well, and that we can look into that ourselves as well. So that brings us to the end of our questions. Thank you so much for coming in this morning to give your evidence. I think it's been very helpful. I think the one bit that's been not so helpful is not getting a timeline on the bill. It, of course, is a matter for us in terms of planning our work programme, so we would really appreciate hearing as soon as possible. But I do take your point that you've had quite a lot of analysis work to do, and I get the sense that there's quite a lot of technical considerations within all of that and the complexity of diverse array of buildings in Scotland. So thanks so much for coming in this morning, and I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow you to leave the room. The next item on our agenda today is to consider the following negative instrument: Building Procedure Scotland Amendment Regulations 2024. Do members have any comments on the instrument? No members have any comments. Just to give a bit of context, we previously agreed to issue a call for views on this negative instrument, which members will recall has been introduced to fulfil a commitment in response to Alex Rowley's Members' Bill on environmental standards for domestic buildings. We received 30 responses to our call for views as noted in the papers, and members will also note that much of the detail on passive house equivalent standards will be confirmed following a further consultation in the summer. And so on that, is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. And we have previously agreed to take the next items in private. So as that was the last public item on our agenda for today, I'm now going to close the public part of the meeting.